Welcome to Liberation Theology. I am so glad that you are interested in learning more about one of the most fascinating theological movements to come out of the past century. There are a lot of different kinds of liberation theology that we're going to be studying, but I think to engage with liberation theology, it's helpful to first have a familiarity with postcolonial theology, which is the relationship between Christianity and the decolonizing movements of the late 20th century. Postcolonial theology joins postcolonial theory as being a shift in doctrine and thought in response to the decolonizing movement of the post-war era. From roughly the beginning of the 1800s through the end of the Second World War, Western European nations embarked on a program of colonizing most of Africa and Asia, in addition to the Central and South American colonies that they were already holding onto. If you've heard of the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, that's because the British Empire once held colonies in every time zone of the world. And this fact should give us pause, because why did the British and the French and the Germans and the Belgians and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Russians and also the Americans believe that they had the right to enter into other countries and take whatever resources they wanted, whether they be human, natural, or material? Why did people in these supposedly Christian nations believe that colonization, exploitation, slavery, and domination were compatible with Christianity? Well, there are a lot of reasons why, but they were helped by colonial theology. Colonial theology is an unofficial theology, a kind of a theological background, if you will, a canvas, that asserts that it is the divine right of predominantly white European nations to enter into spaces, countries, or nations occupied by predominantly non-white populations and act as if whatever is there is theirs. Colonial theology is upheld by three core beliefs: hierarchy, enlightenment, and evangelism, or the responsibility of Christians to enforce their faith and practices onto non-Christians. Colonial theology begins with the belief, then, in the rigid hierarchical system. It communicates a belief in a hierarchical God who is above the monarchs, so the rulers, or even democratically elected governments, who themselves rightly exist in a hierarchy above other systems that govern human beings. For instance, in America, you have the one nation that is under God, who is above the three branches of the government, which is then above all of the other government organizations or expressions, businesses, schools, healthcare organizations, etc. All those institutions that employ humans, and that those institutions are above the humans to which those institutions cater. Hierarchy rightfully governs all of these structures, and in colonial theology, it is asserted that it is the responsibility of those who are in the lower end of the hierarchy to serve those that are above them. So the Church of the Colonial Theologies is also structured in hierarchies. This might be easy to identify in the Catholic Church that has a very clear hierarchical structure, but even in Protestant churches, congregation members are subject either to an authoritative pastor or governing body of congregation members, maybe a group of elders, who knows. There's always a power dynamic that determines who has the final say on belief and on practice. The second principle of colonial theology is enlightenment. Enlightenment proclaims that Christians and Christian nations are the people gifted with the greatest reason or skill or wisdom or power, maybe all of the above. It's the idea that the best people in the world are Christians, and for someone to reach the apex of who they are, then they must conform to the beliefs and the practices of Christian churches and nations. The third principle of colonial theology is the follow-through of enlightenment, the responsibility to spread and enforce Christian beliefs and practices onto others. Because if you want a perfect world, then you need to make everyone into a Christian just like you. Today, we know that as evangelism. So how does colonial theology support colonial projects? Well, by providing the theological justification for domination, for the superiority and supremacy of white European Christian nations and their people, and then to provide a practice of forced conversion and conformity. Colonial theology is empire worship, and it proved remarkably effective at supporting the European empires as they worked to colonize entire continents and claimed that in doing so, they were doing God's will. If you've heard catchphrases like "religion is the opiate of the masses" from Karl Marx, or even just "God is dead" from Friedrich Nietzsche, know that these philosophers were responding to colonial theology. Their critique was of a religion and a God who were devoid of immanence, transformation, or any kind of direct relationship with justice. They were responding to a God who was conceived as a president above presidents, king above king, lord above lords, CEO above CEOs, a God who did not bring transformation to the world, but who perfectly maintained the status quo and enforced an unquestioning acceptance of imperial colonizing power. But after the Second World War, for pragmatic rather than moral reasons, all of the major empires became unable to enforce their colonial projects across the globe. And so, the process of decolonizing began. Countries began granting their former colonies independence, or some former colonies seized independence through revolution or by working within their legislatures to pass independence movements, severing their ties with their colonizers. And gradually, with a few exceptions, all of the areas of the world that had once been held by or controlled by Western European powers became freed from their control. But two matters complicated the decolonizing project, and it didn't turn out so ideal as that narrative would like to suggest. Because as empires left, power vacuums surged in their absence. Imperial powers had destroyed the societies and structures indigenous to those regions and nations. So when imperial governments disappeared, it opened up spaces for the most powerful and violent to seize control. And so many former colonies became overwhelmed by rebellions, revolutions, coups, civil wars, and all kinds of instability. And this instability prevented democratic or rebuilding processes to take shape as was hoped. The second problem was that former colonizing countries didn't just leave and give up their interests. Through corporate power and economic influence, many Western European countries continued to exert influence over former colonies to access the resources and labor to which they felt entitled. This practice resulted in the United States being involved in the activity and governance of many Latin American countries in particular, often supporting dictatorships in the name of opposing communism during the Cold War. This meant that a supposedly Christian nation, as America saw itself in the 1950s and 60s in opposition to the Soviet Union, was supporting violent dictatorships oppressing other countries filled with Christians. And so, postcolonial theology emerged, along with other postcolonial theories from other academic disciplines. If colonial theology emphasized the principles of hierarchy, enlightenment, and expansion, then postcolonial theology replaces these principles with a radical communitarian approach to theology and just all kinds of organization, a deconstructionist perspective towards reason, and a contextual focus on the relationship between God and a particular people. Let's unpack each of these approaches a little bit. First, postcolonial theology lifts up a communitarian approach to doing theology. This critique means that theology must be done from the ground up rather than the top down. If hierarchical theology means that the people with the most power dictate what those with less power must do and believe, then a communitarian approach flips that around. In postcolonial theology, theology begins with the perspective of those with the least power, and those with more power are required to reshape their actions and beliefs accordingly. Second, deconstruction. Postcolonial theology seeks to deconstruct the relationship between theology and rationality. The major project of the Enlightenment was aligning faith and reason to declare a singular truth of how the world works and how people should live. Postcolonial theology challenges the concept of a single truth and seeks to liberate theology from needing to operate within certainties and binaries. It highlights ambiguities, uncertainties, and paradoxes in theology and calls us to look for God in the space between opposites. Perhaps most importantly, postcolonial theology directs our attention to bodies, feelings, and identities, asking what the message of Christianity has to offer to the lived experience of formerly colonized people still suffering at the hands of distant colonial powers. And third, postcolonial theology takes a contextual approach to the study of God and God's relationship to the world. Whereas colonial theology operated with an evangelistic imperative that declared the whole world in need of believing the same faith, the same one truth, postcolonial theology asserts that faith is particular, not universal. What people believe is dependent on who they are, how they exist, what is done to them, what they are called to do, where they live, and the time in which they live. Each of these contextual understandings of God are valid. Now, there's definitely room for debate about how to act and how to live, but a respect for the plurality and multiplicity of perspectives on God is foundational to postcolonial theology. This is why most of the liberation theologies we're going to be studying have an identity component to them. Black theology, feminist theology, queer theology, indigenous theology. It's because these theologies are contextual to identities and bodies and groups of people. So with these key concepts, what are some major themes that you can expect to find in studying either postcolonial theology or liberation theology that differentiate it from traditional, often colonial-influenced Christian theology? Well, one, let's just get this right out of the way. A Marxist understanding of society and economics as a class struggle. Please note that does not mean that postcolonial theology is inherently communist or communist sympathizing, but it does acknowledge that great violence has been done and is being done to poor and marginalized people by more privileged classes in society. And this contextual experience influences the theology that is done by postcolonial and liberation theologies. Material conditions will also come up a lot because material conditions are a major part of how the message of the gospel is experienced and accomplished in liberation theologies. There's also going to be an emphasis on land and the land's role in God's work, concern, and salvation. Liberation theologies focus on readings of the Bible from perspectives of the marginalized, from those identities. There's going to be a focus on discussion, conversation, or forms of doing theology where all participants are equal. And then, while this might go without saying, we're still going to name it, a huge focus, the end goal of liberation theology is justice and reform, and maybe even revolution, as central to God's efforts in the world, especially through the person of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. There's one final topic, and that's the concept of hybridity. Hybridity is a challenging topic in postcolonial theory, theology, and in liberation theology. It's also a hotly debated one, but it's essential to receiving the challenge of postcolonial theory and theology. Hybrids are the product of colonizers who cannot remain separate from the people they colonize. In many cases, hybrids are the literal biracial progeny of colonial and colonized parents. But hybrids can also be understood as those who grow up colonized, but then receive a colonial education that changes their perspective of the world or gives them greater access to knowledge and power. Therefore, they carry the hybrid identity and experience of both colonized and colonizer. Hybrids are the way that colonial projects inevitably undermine their efforts to create a binary, perfectly ordered, hierarchical world. These projects always fail because hybrids emerge to thwart the attempt to keep the colonized and the colonizer separate. And colonizers' efforts to respond to the existence of hybrids is what ultimately destabilizes their projects of power and domination. There are some prominent examples of hybrids in the Bible, including Joseph of Technicolor Dreamcoat fame, Moses, who was born an Israelite but raised in the Egyptian court, Daniel from Daniel in the Lion's Den, who was a Jew who was captured and forced to live and operate in Babylon, and also the person of Jesus. We're going to be talking about that a lot in Liberation Theology. Some recent examples of hybrids or prominent hybrids in history are figures like Mahatma Gandhi or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who were prominent hybrids that brought colonial powers down through their access to colonial resources, yet their radical identification with colonized people. And yet hybrids are often looked at with suspicion by colonized communities and by colonial communities. As people with access to the privilege of the colonizers, they are seen by their own people as those who might choose the comforts of privilege over solidarity with the oppressed. And yet, with their access to the privileges of education, money, and status, hybrids can often be the greatest figureheads for post-colonial revolutions and reforms. And so postcolonial theology pays great attention to the concept of hybrids in Scripture, in theology, and in the modern life of the church, because it is through hybridity that the modern forms of colonization, neo-colonialism as some term it, will be undone. And I conclude with the concept of hybridity in this kind of intro video because it is important to know that you are a hybrid if you choose to study postcolonial and liberation theology. To even have the opportunity to study theology right now sets you apart as a person of privilege, even if you carry a marginalized identity. You have the opportunity to choose whether you wish to study ways of doing theology from the perspectives of the poor, the marginalized, or the oppressed, or to maintain colonial theology. On one hand, that makes you a potentially powerful ally to the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed, not to mention a threat to the powers of the world. On the other hand, you will be looked at with suspicion by those you might sympathize with, given that solidarity with the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed is an option for you, not a necessity. So if you choose to study liberation theology, all of which is done from a post-colonial perspective, be prepared to enter into a challenging space of existence where you will need to navigate between how your faith calls you to radical belief and practice and how your privilege calls you to comfort. It will be a discomforting experience. But entering into hybridity might be exactly how God plans to work through you to turn this world toward justice. Thanks for checking Liberation Theology out. I'll see you at the next class. Take care.